Today's episode of the podcast continues a special three-part series looking ahead to the Unit 5 Diploma exam. In this episode 264, Christine Marsiglio undertakes an assessment of Cava at Level 4. This episode complements episode 263, in which Christine assesses a Prosecco, and episode 265, where she assesses a Champagne. You can find below details of the wine that was being assessed, and also links of student resources for preparing for the diploma, including a link to the Level 4 Standardised approach to tasting wine. Enjoy.
We're talking about Cava now, which isn't one defined region actually within Spain. Most people know it as coming from the Penedès region, which is 95% of where the production is in Spain. But there are other regions within Spain that also produce Cava, for example, in Rioja. But we'll focus on Penedès today because that's where most of the production is. The grapes used in Cava are very different from many other sparkling wines around the world. They are grapes that are really only found within Spain when used in sparkling wine. The main one is Macabeo. It's also known as Viura in Rioja, and that's quite a high acid grape variety. So that's going to bring freshness to most of the Cavas, and it will bring a little bit of apple and maybe citrus fruit flavors as well. And then we have Xarel·lo, which is a native grape to the Penedès region. And that tends to bring a herbal, almost earthy aroma to Cava, and some fennel notes in some cases as well. And then finally we have Parellada, which is the lowest yielding of the three grape varieties, and one of the more difficult to grow. And it tends to have to be planted at higher altitudes because it needs a longer ripening season in order to have this kind of finesse and floral aromas that it will bring to the wine. So those are the three kind of indigenous grapes that are used. However, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are also allowed in Cava these days, though the Cava that we are going to be tasting today is based on the three indigenous grape varieties, with 50% coming from Macabeo, 35% coming from Parellada, and 15% coming from Xarel·lo. So the wine that we're going to be tasting today is the Segura Viudas Reserva Brut. And the grapes here are coming from the Penedès region. So it is a Cava coming from Penedès. So we will start by looking at the wine, as we always do, looking at the appearance of the wine. So here we've got a clear wine with bubbles, and it is quite pale in appearance, and this is lemon color. So clear, pale lemon. Perfect. All right, and if we give that a little swirl, which I tend to do with all the sparkling wines when I'm assessing them, because I don't want to, I want to make sure I'm getting as many aromas as possible. So we can smell that. It smells quite clean, which is good, with a medium plus intensity. And here, the first thing that we pick up is some stone fruit. So when we're using our SAT at diploma level, but also even level 3, you can't be generic. You can't say stone fruit. You would have to say something like peach or apricot. And in this case, I think there's quite a lot of peach, maybe even white peach aromas. A little bit of citrus. Again, have to be a bit specific. So here, you could say lemon, peach. There's a little bit of a floral aroma. Again, that's coming from the Parellada that's in here. So here I would say blossom as well. Now, Cava is a traditional method sparkling wine. So we're also picking up a little bit of this dough or maybe bread crust aroma, maybe a hint of brioche. So that would fall under secondary aromas from winemaking. And normally, Cava only needs to have 9 months on the lees, which isn't generally long enough to pick up many of these secondary aromas. You might get a little hint. However, this is a Reserva, and Reserva is required to spend at least 15 months on lees. So here we really are starting to pick up that secondary aroma of dough and brioche and that yeasty smell. So it's starting to smell a little bit more complex than you would get with some of your more simple Cavas. So, and we might even pick up a little bit of a tertiary note, because this has a little bit of reserve wines as well, so wines coming from previous vintages during the blending process before the secondary fermentation in bottle. So there's a little bit of nuttiness coming through as well, and some earthiness, though that earthiness might be coming from the use of Xarello, the 15% Xarello in here as well. Okay. So we've got some primary, some secondary, and some tertiary aromas. So this is looking to be somewhat of a complex wine. And this is actually, well, we'll talk about this in the conclusion part, but Reserva tends to be a step up in quality than most of the more basic Cavas. Okay. So again, we're going to dip our tongue in to assess the level of sugar. It says it's a Brut, so that means that it's going to fall between 0 and 12 grams per liter. But in a blind tasting exam, it's really difficult to decide, so it's always best to dip the tip of your tongue in just to see how much sugar is in there. So here we can taste that there is a little bit of sweetness, and you really wouldn't notice this at all if you were just tasting the wine, if you were just drinking it for pleasure. But here we would say that this is an off-dry wine on the palate note. And then we can go through and taste it again. So just going back to the level of sweetness with off-dry, with Cava, the way that residual sugar is getting there is from dosage. So after the primary fermentation, which in this case has happened in stainless steel tanks, they've left the base wine on lees for a specific time, for about 3 months. So we're getting some of those brioche and dough aromas from that. And then they're doing the second fermentation in bottle, where the yeast will die after the fermentation is happening, and there they're leaving the wine on the lees in the bottle for 15 months. So that's where those doughy, secondary, kind of yeasty, bready notes are coming from. After they've left the wine on the lees for 15 months, they disgorge that. So it means that they're getting rid of the yeast in the bottle. And then they're adding a dosage of 9 grams per liter in this case. So that's just to help balance out the level of acidity there so that it's not too jarring. So it's a well-balanced wine. And then they bottle it. And in this case, they'll leave it, I believe, for 6 months before selling it. So we have an off-dry wine. I did the dribble test, where you open your mouth again after you spit the wine out to see how much you're salivating. And here we're in a medium plus level of acidity. So it is fairly high. Well, it's medium plus, which you would think, oh, but this is from Spain. Spain is a warm area. How can you get such high levels of acidity? In many cases with Cava, what they're doing is either they're planting grapes at a much higher altitude to ensure that acidity is retained because of the high diurnal range that can be found in the higher altitude regions, or they might pick some of their grapes a little bit early, which will help retain acidity as well. And it's really important for sparkling wines to have high levels of acidity, because then that will help retain the freshness in the wine, so you get a more balanced wine. And that's how they're able to manage that in a slightly warmer climate, such as in Penedès, which is not too far from Barcelona, just to give context for the type of climate that they have there. Okay, so we've gone through sweetness and acidity. Again, we don't have any tannins here because we're tasting a white wine. Alcohol here is medium, so we're at 11.5, so medium, just on the edge of medium minus. Here we're at medium body. So there's a little bit more body here than you would find in, say, a Prosecco, and that's mainly because the grapes are have a little bit more concentration in this case, but also because they've the base wine was aged on lees, which is going to add body and texture, but also the secondary fermentation, where they're then leaving the wine on the lees, will also add a little bit more body. So here we're medium. You could maybe make an argument for medium plus body here as well. And then we have a medium plus flavor intensity, with similar flavors to the nose, where we've got some stone fruit, so peach, nectarine, citrus such as lemon, and then we've got those secondary notes as well of brioche, toast, and a little bit of yeasty doughiness, and that's leading to a medium plus finish as well. Okay, so we now have to think about our quality assessment here. So when we looked at the aromas and the flavors, and it's also very important as a student to know that if you are smelling something, you should ensure that you write similar notes on the palate, because actually aromas and flavors are all detected by your nose. So they should be quite similar. And we noted that there were primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas here. So coming from the grape, coming from winemaking, coming from bottle age as well. So this is looking to be a fairly complex wine. So that is pointing towards a higher quality level. Now, it didn't have a super long finish, so that's probably going to take us away from an outstanding level of quality. However, if this were a Gran Reserva, where it would be kept on the lees for over 30 months, then probably that would have the longer finish that would be required for, say, an outstanding wine. The balance between acid and sugar here is really well done. So that's another tick for very good quality level. And it's actually very typical of a cava. So you've got some of those secondary aromas, and it's got this kind of earthy fennel, but also floral notes that are very typical with these grape varieties that are used. So we can put this in the very good category as well. Now, most sparkling wines, when they're released, other than with the exception of vintage champagnes or some other vintage sparkling wines, are ready to be consumed when they're released. And I think this is drinking very well right now. However, because it does have that higher level of medium plus acidity, and it already has some of those tertiary aromas, you could probably age this for a few years, and it will improve with age over maybe 2 to 3 years. So I think you could make an argument for can drink now, but has some potential for aging as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, that again, taking us through the SAT at level 4 there, and I think we're doing a really good job of relating what's in the glass back to those production techniques in Cava and what they bring to the finished wine. I just then invite you again just to say something about the theory side of the exam in contrast to what you've just done there.
Great. For Cava, obviously it's not for sure that you would get a question on Cava, but it would be important for you to know for the exam many things about Cava, because it's a very important sparkling wine region to know about. So again, like we talked about, 95% of the production is coming from the Penedès region in Spain. And altitude plays a very important role with grape growing there to moderate the really quite warm climate, the Mediterranean climate that they have. So knowing the different levels that grapes are planted at, and actually what grapes are planted where. So Macabeo is planted at a much higher altitude than, say, Xarel·lo, for example, versus Parellada. And knowing the other grapes that are used as well, and also knowing about rosé cava. So you don't see it very frequently. There isn't much produced, but there are red grapes, some of which are native to the region, so trepat, that can be used for rosado styles of cava as well. Knowing, again, the production method, we've talked about that this is a traditional method sparkling wine, which involves secondary fermentation in bottle. However, knowing that hand harvesting is quite common in Cava again, and why that's done, not just for Cava, but other sparkling wines. Contrasting this with, say, champagne, where in this case, malolactic fermentation tends to be avoided in Cava because they're trying to retain the acidity that they've worked so hard in the vineyard to keep, because in warmer climates, you tend to lose acidity more quickly. So with many cavas, malolactic fermentation is avoided. Again, most cavas, unlike in champagne, don't have to use that many reserve wines. And again, this is because they have a much more even climate and less difficulty ripening grapes there. So there's no need to keep reserve wines back to even out more difficult vintages, for example. Knowing the minimum aging requirements is also quite important. So basic Cava is 9 months on the leaves, Reserva is 15, and Gran Reserva is 30. Also knowing about paraje, which is a new term being used in bottling in Cava, which is about single estate wines, and that's come out as of 2017, and how they have different yields and different aging requirements as well. So there are many things to know about Cava, but also big producers. So some important producers such as Freixenet and Cordonieu, Segura, Viudas. So there are many things that as a student you would be expected to know for your exam, but also trying to relate those back to the style of wine that is produced is quite important.
So just a follow-up question, really on the theory, I guess, and kind of getting a real understanding of kind of what's happening in Cava. I mean, are there any particular resources or approaches that you'd recommend? I mean, obviously, sitting as we are here in London, Barcelona is not that far away, and you can very quickly be in Penedès from Barcelona. So, yeah, I'm just wondering, what might you recommend for somebody either who can get to the regions or somebody who might be further away and actually can't get there so easily?
Yeah, I mean, if you do have the possibility to go to Penedès, Sant Sadurní d'Anoia. Sorry, I've actually been there and I found it quite difficult to pronounce even when I was there. But if you do have the possibility to go, it's a great region to visit. If you don't, then finding different cavas to taste that aren't just the basic entry-level cava. So looking at the reservas, if you can get your hands on a Gran Reserva to taste, then you can really see the differences in production method there. Obviously, your main textbook, the Oxford Companion to Wine by Jancis Robinson, has a lot of information about cava in there, but the Consejo for Cava also has really amazing resources. If you go on some of the producer websites as well, they really walk you through. They have very interactive websites that are quite helpful to walk you through not only the production method, but also the region and where the grapes come from. And I found those very helpful. I was fortunate enough to actually go to one of the big producers, and they showed me around, and that was very, very helpful for my own studies. But that's not always possible. So yes, the websites are great. If you can go to some of the trade tastings that involve sparkling wine or Cava specifically, then that's a wonderful way to taste different wines and to talk to people about the production and about the region and about the big producers and perhaps find some small interesting producers too.
Like yourself, I have travelled to Penedès, and I think one of the interesting things that came up when they were kind of giving me the intro was that kind of, I guess, uniqueness around you can have Cava made in Extremadura, you can have it made in Rioja, you can have it made in all those sort of different parts of Spain. And I'm just curious and wondering, could you perhaps say something about those other production methods and perhaps in the context of the exam as well, and how expected students are to know about those other styles and types of Cava from different parts of Spain?
The basic production method throughout Spain is the same. So it is the traditional method. There are very specific rules that they have to follow. So the aging requirements are all the same. And the grape varieties may differ slightly, but generally the rules are the same. I've never actually had a cava from Extremadura, but of course they do exist. I think they tend to be sold more within the local market. I think, and again, I'm not an examiner, so I need to just put that in as an aside. But I think that the main region to focus on would be Penedès, because that's really where most of the production is coming from. If you do have the time, of course, try and look into a little bit more about the production in Rioja and Extremadura as well. But if you're limited with time, I would focus on the Penedès region and the main grape varieties from there and the big producers from that region too.
Thanks once again to Christine for assessing today's wine, the Cava. You can also find her assessment of the Prosecco in episode 263. And next time will be Champagne in episode 265. If you're not already, please do subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. That way you'll be automatically informed when future episodes are posted. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media. I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you in the next episode for the third and final part of this 3-part series, Champagne Assessed at Level 4.